Thanks for staying with us. Uganda's parliament has passed a new draft of an anti-gay legislation after President Yoweri Museveni sent it back for amendment. Lawmakers retained many of the draconian provisions, despite Museveni's call to rework the earlier version. Now, MPs amended portions of the bill to clarity that merely identifying as gay would be criminalized, but engaging in homosexual acts would still be punishable with life imprisonment. They also rejected Museveni's call to delete a provision making homosexuality a capital offense. This means that repeat offenders could be sentenced to death. Access Chapter 2 Executive Director Steve Letsike joins us now for reaction on the story. A very good evening to you, Steve. Thank you so much for your time. One of the world's strictest anti-LGBTQI+ bills have been passed, mostly unchanged, despite President Museveni asking for some amendments. What's your reaction?
My reaction is that, LGBTI people will continue and constantly live in fear and stressed for their life, and the fact that this law that has been passed now by Parliament, which is suggested to be reworked, and it's really not reworked because it still constitutes aggression, intimidation, harassment, and the proposed legislation threatens, the physical and mental integrity of LGBTI people. And for us, this is a tragedy because it still represents the worst law in these decades ever developed by Ugandan Parliament. And really, even if this law is taken to the president, if he has some sense of consciousness, he's ought to look at whether is this not a human rights violation, as we always have cautioned against.
There's been many calls for some assistance as you look at the LGBTQI+ community in Uganda. They had already been living in fear, despite this stamp now, which legalizes many aspects of how they live their day-to-day lives. What kind of perceptions do you think this bill will further exacerbate in Uganda?
Look, the exacerbation would have to even be analyzed in terms of the history that the anti-homosexuality bill has been introduced in Uganda. This is not the first time, because we recall, just over 10 years ago, the first anti-homosexuality bill introduced in 2009 and further 2012 and so forth, which has gone through court systems to a point in 2014 it was chucked out of court. And there's now a reintroduction back in and out, 15 years of law processing in Uganda. But one thing that we need to know, all this introduction, all this fundamental approach spear hate, and they spear division in society. They threaten family, they threaten the livelihood, they threaten the lives of LGBTI people. In fact, we've even seen an increase of people fleeing persecution. We've seen, even just in the last month, when the first passing of the bill was done a month ago, and we have seen many LGBTI people being arrested, harassed, and many fearing for their lives, including their families. So what we are seeing is not just a matter of an introduction of law that seeks to erase people. It's actually including a state-funded, because parliament and legislators are arms of state. They are state-funded homophobia and transphobia, and that's what we see in the pure violation of human rights and disregard of their own constitution, disregard of the African Charter and the Resolution 275 of the Human Rights Commission of the Human and People's Rights in Africa. These are our mechanisms that we've put as Africans, and even the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. What do we do when the lives are at stake? We cannot be silent, and we cannot accept that we perpetuate violence against human beings.
Yeah. I mean, one activist in Uganda was saying that this bill is instead being used as a facade to distract the public from the country's failures to address some of their economic challenges. And also the White House warned Uganda that if this law comes into force, the country is going to face some possible economic repercussions. Do you think that in itself will perhaps be enough momentum to see some sort of action around reworking and revisiting this, because we don't know what President Museveni's reaction is, because we don't know how much of the changes he approved?
Well, I think what is quite important, we have to look at whether the new law, which is no exception and forms part of worrying trend of intolerance and exacerbation of stigma against LGBTI persons without any ground, because even whatever that has been reintroduced and has been reworked as a language, none of these language actually helps out to secure the rights, freedom of privacy, freedom of expression, association, and even the idea of freedom of access to services, shelter, health, and so forth. In fact, the reintroduction of this law has complete disregard towards respect of human rights and acceptance of difference. And Ugandan people, Ugandan government, and even Ugandan lawmakers, cannot bypass, their own ability to reflect on their contribution to this. So for us, as much as this has been passed by Parliament, it's now sitting in the conscience of the President, but it's also sitting with the judiciary to whether this constitutes a very healthy and a very good policy to introduce, or it must be chucked out. I have no doubt our allies, our partners, and our organization that we work with will stand up and to support the Ugandan LGBTI to fight this law, even if we take it through the judiciary system in Uganda.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time and weighing in on the discussion. Access Chapter 2 Executive Director Steve Letsike weighing in there on the Uganda homosexual bill.